Okay, so our next set of videos is going to go through the remaining part, or this next video, I should say, because it goes quite quickly. Because as you'll see in the remaining part of Chapter 3 of Sports, Chapter 9 of the new edition, is again more review and some activities that, such as projectile motion, that aren't really going to be covered later and tested for students, and a few activities that you may want to skip due to time restraints. You'll see it as I talk about the pacing guide. So let's jump right into 3.4, projectile motion on the moon. If you remember previously in the sports chapter on projectile motion, I mentioned that students aren't going to really need to know about projectile motion for some strange reason. It's not really tested on for them, and not really emphasized in our standards. So once again, I'm going to tell you, you can skip this lesson on projectile motion. All right. So you go ahead and skip that and move right on to 3.5, jumping on the moon. So let's take a look at that. This is one that students tend to like. If we look at the lesson, jumping on the moon, you can see the little astronaut playing basketball. Who hasn't really thought about dunking on the moon? I mean, really. I mean, let's be honest. So, students are going to, measure their vertical jump in this activity, which a lot of students, particularly I find the ones interested in basketball, like doing. But it's pretty interesting to measure their vertical jump, and it provides a nice review on potential energy, mainly gravitational potential energy, the energy of position due to height, and kinetic energy. So a couple ways I like to start this. The book mentions, at least the older book, I don't know if the new edition does, but it does mention Michael Jordan. And I'd like to show a little highlight reels of his dunks to really start us off and get students engaged. And of course, who cannot think about jumping on the moon without mentioning Space Jam here? Enough said there. Anyways, but the activity and doing some practice with these problems here, I mean, that's really what this lesson will be all about. And so it provides a lot of review on potential and kinetic energy and more practice on those concepts and solving those problems. So that's where I like to take this lesson. All right, let's take a look at 3.6, which would be, all right, the mini challenge. You could skip this part, or you could go through it. It doesn't take long for them to introduce the sport they're thinking about doing. But 3.6, let's take a look at this. So this is going to be a bit of a review of momentum, gravity, golf on the moon. Now, if we look at the pacing guide, it says commit for time constraints. And I often do omit this lesson, mainly because in the older edition here we go, this little apparatus setup, often, it's difficult to get these correct length, and it's just sometimes it's a pain to set up, and students don't really get a lot out of that. So what you could do instead is, talk a bit, since it is about collisions and momentum, you can use this to review those concepts, collisions, conservation of momentum, and, even do some more of those momentum problems. So that's what I would do during this lesson. If you have the time, just really emphasize collisions, momentum, conservation, momentum, some momentum problems. So, use it as a review. All right. So let's take a look at the next lesson, friction on the moon. Okay. So friction on the moon, lesson 7. If you look at the pacing guide here, friction on the moon, it says should be quick, move the shoe from sports 2. So remember, we did friction already. We did activity on that. So yes, this should be a quick little review for students. And basically, it's very similar to what they did, except instead of using a shoe, they're going to be using a little wooden box. If you don't have that, just find a cardboard box and some string that you could hook up to a spring scale and measure the force. And I like to emphasize here for force, 2 columns. I like to have static right before it moves and slide-in friction or kinetic friction while it's moving. Very important for the standards. You can see it's included here in the pacing guide. Make sure that you use the term static and kinetic friction. So static friction is always a greater force than kinetic friction. So make sure you emphasize that and set up the lab with those 2 columns so they could do it that way. All right, friction on the moon. Again, a lot of review in this Sports 3. So a lot of these things we already did before. All right, let's look at 8. Bounding on the moon. Okay, so for lesson 8, Bounding on the Moon, modeling human motion, what I like to actually do during this part, let's just talk about it, is I could either skip this lesson or I can relate it to pendulum energy transfers. If you look at the pacing guide, all right, it mentions pendulum not covered in standards, okay? So this lesson's a bit about some pendulum stuff. But it's true that they don't need to know a lot about pendulums in the standards. But what you can do is relate the concept of a pendulum back to potential kinetic energy and energy transfer. So this may be a little helpful review for students. If you remember in the waves videos I did on communications, I showed you that Georgia public broadcasting link to that video where there is actual pendulum lab part to that that students may or may not have done depending on if you wanted to do it, but just something to consider if you're thinking about doing something with pendulums. At least for our focus in the standards, it's really going to be about the potential kinetic energy and transfer between them. So that's what you should emphasize here. If you decide to not skip this lesson, you could at least pull this out of it. The energy transfer is there. All right, airy indoor sports, the next and last little lesson here, airy indoor sports. As you can imagine from the title, it's all going to be about air resistance and gravity. So another review. Here's a good time to really do some more free body diagrams. As it mentions in the pacing guide, you'll see that. And, I like to review with either the matching activity. Remember when this first was introduced to you, I showed you a link to the matching activity, I believe in Sports Chapter 2, when free body diagrams were first introduced. And or create a bingo game. And remember I did motion graph. I talked about motion graph bingos game to create for your students back when we first had Sports Chapter 2. Here's another great thing you could do for students. If you make little bingo cards with different free body diagrams and you describe some events happening and what free body diagram matches up, students really get into that. So again, this is just another review on something students already know. As you can see, Sports Chapter 3 is pretty much all review for students. And then finally you get to the chapter challenge, which I just mentioned before in the first video, but mostly review here. So I don't really stress a traditional summative assessment at the end, a traditional test, since students already were kind of tested on these concepts previously. So you could just move on to the next unit, which introduces a lot of new content. So you can see that in the next series of videos as we move on to now Home Chapter 2, a lot of new stuff on electricity that's going to be covered there. So tune into those videos next.